So this is a little bit the structure of what I'm going to talk about. I will start with the very short presentation of the architecture of the models underlying large language models, like the ones in the GPT class. I will just treat it as a class. And I will do this in order to establish where the large sequence models come into play in the architecture. And in short, I will say that large sequence models are part of the RLHF fine-tuning layer of the architecture, which means reinforcement learning with human feedback. And this RLHF is actually a core innovation behind some of the impressive results from the past several years in this field, like the fact that these models perform excellently in tasks involving translation, summarization, and most recently, even reasoning. Into the second part, I will dive a little bit deeper into how these large sequence models work. And we will see that they work in two different ways, as predictive models or as models for next word prediction, and as sequential decision makers, or we may call them agents, maximizing some reward in a reinforcement learning environment. We will see that this double functionality of sequence models, as both probabilistic models and as agents, raises a sort of deeper issue, which has to do with confounding, which is a notion well known from causal inference. And that is why I mentioned Pearl there and his book on causality. It's an old book, but the problem or the issue that I'm trying to point towards is rather theoretical in nature, so it's not necessarily an engineering problem. So older literature may actually do something here. Okay. After discussing a little bit about confounding in large sequence models, I will try to say that this leads to so-called auto-suggestive delusions. And these delusions actually are systematic in these models. That is, they accumulate in the sequential decision-making of the models with obvious implications for large language models, because as they amplify, we will see that models are fine-tuned not only on human-generated data, but on model-generated data as well. And if these delusions are present in the generated data of the models, once you use that data again for training, those illusions tend to amplify. Finally, I will try to add a sort of philosophical note to this discussion, aimed to showcase that we are indeed facing an issue with some deeper conceptual ramifications. Basically, that one can learn the right reasons for actions by merely observing and imitating experts who perform those actions has been one of the skeptical cornerstones in analytic philosophy since forever, like since Ludwig Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations. So this will be basically the whole thing. Hopefully, I will manage to go through all of it. Okay. The layering of those GPTs that I was telling you about. As we know, at the bottom, there is a foundation model or a transformer, which, as we all know, is pre-trained on next word or next token prediction tasks. On top of that, we also have a deep reinforcement learning layer, which implements a technique called reinforcement learning with human feedback, the RLHF, that I was telling you about for fine-tuning the model. It is interesting here that this fine-tuning happens in a setting that is both general allowing the language model to perform a variety of tasks like translation, summarization, reasoning, etc., and interactive. Also, it is important to stress here that GPTs can be foundation models for other, even more fine-tuned models, like, for instance, deep research. This structure in layers is something important to emphasize because an issue that occurs in a foundation model usually propagates or cascades further into the more fine-tuned models. I will not insist on the transformer architecture, although this one is also packed with interesting innovations. Instead, I will focus on the reinforcement learning layer. And as you can see, there are two words that I underlined in italics, general and interactive setting. This is important. The fact that the setting for the fine-tuning of the models is general hints towards those general AI ambitions often voiced by tech companies like OpenAI. So they want models that are very general. The fact that the setting is interactive means that the same model is basically used both for prediction and for the generation of data. In other words, in an interactive setting like the usual chat box, the language model does both things. It predicts and also it acts based on its own predictions. And this is why my title about doing and observing in sequence models. I haven't talked about sequence models yet, but we are getting there. This is, large sequence models. Okay, where do they come into the story? As I briefly mentioned in the introduction, sequence models come into play in the RLHF layer of the large language model structure. The basic intuition is that, for example, chatting with ChatGPT is sequential in nature. The conversation proceedings in steps towards some optimal answer. Sequence models actually implement this intuition. In translation, summarization, or in specific reasoning tasks, we usually have at least a partial representation of the optimal answer. In chatting, not necessarily. We may have or we may not have a representation of where we want to get to. But in all cases, the conversation with ChatGPT, let's say, is a sequential process of approximating this optimal answer for which we may or may not have a complete representation. So, in this setting, the agent is expecting the model or slash the agent. I will probably just switch between these two concepts at some points in my presentation, but I hope I'm clear. So the agent is expected to gradually adapt by learning a way of maximizing its reward in each step of the interaction with us. Okay. Here I'm trying to, let's say, look into more detail into how this thing happens. In order to gradually adapt to a task, the agent interacts with the environment over multiple steps. And to interact at each step, the agent receives an observation from the environment and takes an action accordingly. Let us say that we interact with ChatGPT, asking it to do the summarization of a piece of text. The process starts with the agent receiving an observation in the prompt from us. We feed it a piece of text, which is followed by the agent issuing an action A, let's say, which means that it provides us in turn with a different piece of text, which should be the summary of that text. The state of the environment is updated based on the reward. The RL algorithm there calculates that reward for that action. For example, if the piece of text generated by ChatGPT is not a summarization or a best summarization according to the reward function in the RL algorithm, no reward is assigned. Otherwise, the reward is positive. If the reward is positive, then the state of the environment is updated with the text generated by the agent in action A. If not, the state of the environment remains, let's say, the same, and the process starts again. This is a very schematic representation of that, of what happens in the RL layer of the model. Okay, this is where the particle large becomes relevant to the discussion. In traditional reinforcement learning, the reward assigned to the action A is given by an explicit reward function encoded in the RL algorithm. In deep RL, however, the reward function is not explicitly given. Instead, it is learned. The agent learns it by itself from the human feedback it receives along the way. This means that behind learning the reward function, there is, in fact, a deep neural net with lots of parameters, hence the large model. I have a clip here, and I don't know if I can show it, but my hope is that we can see a little bit how human feedback works in this reinforcement learning with the human feedback technique. The clip is not from a language model. It is just a toy illustration of the principle. Yeah, it's YouTube. Anyway, basically here the agent learns to do a backflip, and the human feedback is, for instance, the human says which of the two, the right or the left move, is better. As explained in the quote that I cannot show you momentarily, our agent starts by acting randomly in the environment. Periodically, two clips of its behavior are shown to a human. The human decides which of the two clips is closer to achieving the goal, doing the backflip. Based on this, the agent gradually builds a representation of the goal of the task, right, by finding the reward function that best explains the human's judgments. I have to close this. Okay. Mutatis mutandis, this is how learning summarization tasks in language model can work. Periodically to the agents are given two versions of the same text, two summarized versions of the same text. The human agent picks one, and gradually the agent learns how to do summarization in this manner. It is important that, as you can see, it's not supervised. It's basically unsupervised learning, but I will not go into that discussion here because it will take a little longer. Okay, I will move to the confounders problem that we can identify in this learning process. This diagram emphasizes, according to Pearl, the causal structure of the task. It's a causal diagram of the task. And in this situation, it has to maximize its reward for its answers without knowing the optimal answer beforehand. So what we have here in this representation, let's say theta is the optimal state or answer that we want to obtain from the model. In order to get a grip of this theta, the agent has to learn something and makes, in this respect, some observations. From observing the human expert, who has at least a pre-existing knowledge of theta, of the optimal answer, the model predicts that the action answer with S1 has the outcome okay, while the action answer with S2 has the outcome not okay. Okay, what is even more interesting here is that in this learning process, in which the agent observes the expert, theta is a confounder. That is, simply said, the underlying factor that explains the correlation that the agent sees between an action, S1 or S2, to the outcome okay and not okay. And this is how it learns the reward. Unless if there were no theta, those things would not be correlated, the action and the outcome, okay or not okay. And in this sense, this diagram shows how the optimal answer is, in fact, a confounder. I hope it's clear from the intuitive explanation that I gave. This is Pearl's representation of confounders in causality. Well, auto-suggestive delusions occur because in reality, as we know, the agent has no pre-existing knowledge of theta when prompted to issue an action A. So there's a problem there from theta to A. It only knows that the action answer with S1 has a positive reward because theta is the confounder which connects the two. So it only knows that the action has a positive reward. So, because it has a positive reward, it considers evidence about theta. Okay? Theta that it doesn't know. Okay? And so it stashes among its observations. It has a positive reward, the outcome is good, so it learns something. It stashes among its ground truth data. And it updates the state of the environment to S1, as I showed earlier, that after an action is given a positive reward, the state of the environment is updated. So the state of the environment is updated to S1, and S1 becomes part of its ground truth data. Although, as we have seen, its connection to theta, the actual state of the world that is explaining A, is severe in this case. And this is typically an auto-suggestive delusion. In short, an auto-suggestive delusion is taking an action for a ground truth fact, observation, or ground truth data. This is something that a team from Deep2Mind has shown in a paper from 2021. Ortega et al. From that. We quoted there. And it is a very interesting result because it's theoretical. It's not something that has to do with engineering. Okay, this is just for having a little fun in the presentation. To suggest an intuitive analogy, taking actions as observations is something quite common in human practice. We can see it, for instance, in what we call self-fulfilling prophecies. For instance, we are very familiar with the following story. An individual expects a rejection in romantic relationships, which of course makes them anxious, which leads them to act withdrawn or overly cautious, which eventually pushes potential partners away. So the romantic rejection. I have in, but I'm not going to that. I will present it later. I have an illustration of a auto-suggestive delusion in a language model, but let me go on with my presentation. So, turning back to our discussion, in large sequence models, what is even more important is that the auto-suggestive delusions, as I said, are amplificative, because generated data are constantly fed into the model as ground truth data, as the model continuously updates the state of the environment. Also, these auto-suggestive delusions are very pervasive because they propagate into all the models that are even more fine-tuned from the models that we can say are foundation models for those fine-tuned models, cascaded downwards. Okay, this is the problem. And now I will move a little to the philosophical discussion part, maybe. The more philosophical discussion part, maybe. This is something that I tried to argue elsewhere in another paper. Because at an even deeper level, all this creates a tension about what we call the normativity of actions, or the fact that we usually believe that actions take place in a normative context. It is not just general interactive, it also should be normative in a sense. We say, for instance, that actions have reasons. The human expert in all our experiments picks actions based on reasons. The agent, on the other hand, only observes the expert and their action. And as we have seen, the model does not know data, or does not even have a partial representation of it. This means basically that the agent either does not have any reasons for their action, or it does not have the right reasons, or the reasons that we expect them to have. So if we are to concede any normativity or expertise to what large language models do, and not say that they just mimic blindly, like parrots, what humans do, then that normativity can only derive from the latent representations that the agents build of their goals, which, however, as we have seen, are subject to auto-suggestive delusions. So even if it approximates that goal, that approximation can be of something that is delusional. So are their actions based on reasons? In this case, this is a very toy example of what can happen in a conversation due to auto-suggestive delusions. This is also taken from Ortega et al. This is a made-up conversation which illustrates auto-suggestive delusions in the following manner. Once cheeseburgers are on the menu is introduced among the ground truth data of the model, probably due to something that the model has learned before, maybe fast food restaurants reviews and so on, rated by humans. Of course, in which cheeseburgers are the usual dish. Statistically, it's highly probable that you will find cheeseburgers on the menu. So it learns and it adds it to its ground truth data that cheeseburgers are on the menu. So the model keeps recommending cheeseburgers, because this is what it learned. Even though, in this case, we have a less likely fast food restaurant which serves tacos instead of cheeseburgers. This is a way of showing in a very toy-like manner that this is systematic. Also, this led me in another paper to say that, well, at best, what we have here is a kind of subtle form of solipsism. Of course, I'm not going to discuss philosophical solipsism here. It's just a way of saying that in the best case scenario, the agent perhaps builds a coherent private world around itself, in which cheeseburgers are on the menu, but entirely disconnected from the real or human world as we know it, because it doesn't know theta, neither completely nor partially. In our case, the human case, on the other hand, solipsism seems precluded by these normative practices that we are part of, like the fact that actions usually follow from causal representations of the world around us, rather than just made-up representations. For example, we call firefighters to extinguish a fire because there is a fire. The model, on the other hand, chooses in our discussion this action because its reward in relation to the outcome extinguishing fires is very high, is positive. Regardless whether there is indeed a fire or not in the world. There is no causal link there. Our representations of the world are full of causal links. Models' representations of the world have no such things inside. Hence, the pervasiveness of the delusion. I will only add, this is basically the last slide, and I will only add to this a very short comment, the last one. Of course, this problem is not something that cannot be tackled in an engineering fashion, of course. One way of doing it, for instance, is to separate very neatly between human-generated data and model-generated data in all the phases of training or fine-tuning the model. Another way of going through it is basically train even larger models with even more parameters on larger amounts of data labeled by humans. So instead of doing everything implicitly, you start to do it a little bit more explicitly. You label the data. You tell it what the data is about when it learns. But of course, this is extremely expensive. And we can imagine farms of people actually labeling data, and it's crazy. Another way to go about it is to use more supervised learning than unsupervised learning. So to give it explicit information about what it is supposed to learn and how this reward function should look like. But the overall cost of all this, comes to what I told you at the beginning about generalization. And the moment you start doing all this stuff, you begin losing on the generalization capacity of the models. And so you are not actually in the general AI research project very comfortable. And this is basically my skeptical point, that here there's constant trade-off between surpassing such difficulties and gaining in generalization and generality of the models. And this trade-off is somehow unavoidable. Thank you. That was